This is Ag Matters PM from the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, brought to you by the Iowa Soybean Association, your source for the latest Iowa ag news headlines right here in the heart of the heartland. With reports from our award-winning team of Dustin Hoffman, Riley Smith, Mark Magnuson, and Andy Peterson. Now, from the IARN studios in Des Moines, here's Mark.
Hello and welcome into Ag Matters PM on the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network. I'm Mark Magnuson. Today is Wednesday, October 22nd, 2025, and we're so glad you can join us for today's show. In today's episode, I will be joined by Kenan Layden of agmarket.net for our closing market discussion. But first, it is my interview with Tryston Beyrer of Mosaic as we learn about the crop nutrient removal calculator. Mark Magnuson for the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network, and I'm joined today by Tryston Beyrer. He is the crop nutrition lead with Mosaic, and I'm joined today by Tryston to talk about a topic that I'm not sure the average person that's not involved in farming fully understands, that when we get to the end of a growing season, of course, we move into harvest, but we're already starting to think about next year. So Tryston, could you tell us, please, first of all, just that 30,000 foot view, how does crop, when we look at the entire soil fertility, how that relates to crop yields and exactly what we see in a year-to-year basis?
Yeah, I think the way that I look at crop yield and how it's dependent on soil fertility is a couple of things that resonate with me. There's been a number of articles that have looked at how important is soil fertility or crop nutrition to yield. And there's some papers that show that up to 60% of yield is dependent on soil fertility. So that, I think, sets the foundation that soil fertility and crop nutrition is really important. The question is, depending on what our yield level is, how related is the nutrients and that value. I think the easiest way that I think about it is, when you're removing bushels off the field, that's basically also removing pounds of nutrients, which have to be replaced in order to sustain those yields for future years. Obviously, there might be years that are above or below average yields that we can tweak those rates, but I think that gives us a good starting point of understanding what is crop nutrient removal, and that's very associated and closely tied with our yield levels.
So when we're thinking about at like this point of the season, of course, we're heavy with harvest, we're moving right along, but we're already starting to think about next season. So we're thinking about those nutrients that were removed from our fields based on the growing season, based on harvest and what was taken out of that field. What is that very first starting point then to try and determine what is needed going into next year?
I think the thing that you need to start with is having a good conversation with your local agronomist or trusted advisor and compile not just one data source, but multiple data sources to make the best agronomic decision you have. A couple of my favorite tools, if I were to name just a couple, would be that of soil tests to understand what is your fertility level and perhaps how variable is it across the field. Perhaps there's areas that we can maintain those levels. There's others where we might be able to draw down if they're above our optimum levels. And there's other areas that to increase our yields and productivity, we might have to increase those soil test levels. The other metric that I'd be looking at is hopefully you have a well-calibrated combine that can provide some sort of yield map that shows a variability across the field, or at minimum weigh tickets to know how many bushels of grain that you hauled off that field. If you know the yield per field, or better yet, yield per zone, you can then make more prescriptive applications of understanding what was the nutrients that were removed from those specific areas.
And I know that Mosaic is trying to take everything into account here and trying to come up with a tool that has kind of helped to solidify the picture for growers and help them to know what they need going forward. And they've come up with, at Mosaic, the nutrient removal calculator. Could you tell us about that tool, please?
Yeah, the crop nutrient removal calculator really starts with a couple of background information that makes it easier for growers and agronomists to use to identify how much nutrients are removed. It starts off the principle that it takes a number of different data resources of published literature that shows what is the typical nutrients that are removed per unit of yield for different crops. We have things that are really popular in our geography, such as corn and soybeans, but we also get into small grains and alfalfa forages and other unique specialty crops. Basically, we can set our yield level that we either achieved or hope to achieve if we're planning for next year's cropping system, and then can have a scroller bar to identify what were the pounds of nutrients removed. Usually it'll give things such as nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and there's some other nutrients as well. And our recommendations start with understanding nutrient removal, but it can go beyond that of understanding cycling throughout the season, understanding when nutrients are important for crop availability. And there's other things on cropnutrition.com that would relate to understanding what forms of nutrients are providing that availability and how we can best deliver those nutrients to hopefully optimize yields and ultimately the return on the fertilizer investment by putting dollars back in your pocket.
And to that very last point, I mean, you're going to be doing soil testing like you talked about, using a tool like the crop nutrient removal calculator. It's all with that end goal in mind, isn't it, of having your fertilizer that you do apply, especially at a time now when fertilizer prices are so high, to have that fertilizer working in the most efficient manner and using it most efficiently to hopefully help you save a little bit of money, or at least you make that dollar go as far as it can.
Definitely. And even outside of the nutrient removal calculator, there's other tools on there that actually shows profitability. There's a grower calculator for microessentials and Aspire, depending if you're focused on phosphorus or potassium or the different nutrients that come with those, such as sulfur or nitrogen with microessentials or the two forms of boron with Aspire. But what the grower calculators can do is try to look at on a per acre basis and how many acres you're running. The typical yield results that we've seen based on those fertilizers and how they can perform better than commodity fertilizers out there by providing superior fertilizer nutrition programs. And what that can do is put more bushels and ultimately more dollars back in the grower's pocket.
And based on what you're talking about here today, Tryston, as well, I'm also thinking that, yes, you're learning a lot about what you need for next year, but this is also a kind of a long-term approach, isn't it, to soil health and your fertility and making sure that you're set up for the long run.
Yeah, when you've mentioned soil health, there's a lot of different ways to measure that. But one of my simple explanations is that you can gauge soil health by its productivity, ultimately your yield. If you're doing things to improve your soil health and can make better productive soils for your crop, ultimately the bushels at the end of the day will help determine that. And ways that we can help with that is identifying which nutrients are most limiting and provide nutrients that are available maybe at different times of the year that certain nutrients like maybe sulfate, single source nutrients that might fall short by being leached out of the profile or not as available later in the season when it's really important for grain fill and quality and making some of the components like protein. So there's a lot of times multiple faceted ways that we can try to address closing that yield gap for producers.
He is Tryston Beyrer with Mosaic, my guest here today, talking about thinking ahead to next year already, even though we are in the midst of harvest. Tryston, is there anything else you would like to let our Iowa growers know about when it comes to all these tools that we've talked about here today, specifically the crop nutrient removal calculator, or just anything else that you're excited about?
Yeah, I guess the last thing that I would remind you is that obviously there's the agronomic component of making better predictive applications for matching those nutrient removals based on what the crop is taking up. But the other aspect is the economics. Look at some of those ROI tools, and one of the things you'll find is that there's some producers who decided the last year or two they may have made cuts to their fertility program, not applying that of what the crop needs to meet those crop nutrients. What that means is we're mining our soils out of some of that fertility, and the only way that it can combat that is to apply a higher rate of fertility at some point down the road in the future. I think if you're not matching those fertility needs, using this nutrient removal tool can help identify what's the bare minimum I should be, and then maybe have a discussion of where can we come up back with higher rates at some point down the road if it's the field and soil test warrants it. For example, a 250 bushel per acre corn crop is going to remove about 220 pounds of microessentials or a little over 80 pounds of P2O5 per acre. So whether it's MAP or microessentials or some other fertilizer source of phosphorus, if you're not applying that much, we're mining our soils down, and that's going to limit our long-term productivity of our field. And the best way to combat that is trying to maintain those fertility levels.
And to your last point, once again, I mean, it's also, isn't the take home there that yes, it might look like you're saving money on paper when you work it all out and you want to cut back on these things. But at the end of the day, like you mentioned, if you don't have that fertility where it needs to be, it's going to catch up with you in the long run.
For sure. I say it's a layered approach of where I want that fertility. Try not to make any drastic cuts, and if not, or should I say maybe even drastic changes. Trying to layer in the nutrients. Every single year, or at least biennial applications if you're doing 2-year spreads, and making sure that nutrients are throughout the soil profile so that roots can intercept them as we get into different time periods throughout the growing season. That's the best way to help with your long term crop nutrition program.
He is Tryston Beyrer with Mosaic, my guest here today. Tryston, thanks so much for the time. Always appreciate it, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Tryston Beyrer of Mosaic for that interesting conversation. Very unique tool there from Mosaic with the crop nutrient removal calculator. It is time now for the closing market discussion. I will be joined by Kenan Layden of agmarket.net. But first, a word from the Iowa Soybean Association and the Soy Checkoff.
Iowa Soybean Association is driven to deliver for Iowa's 40,000 soybean farmers. We're proud to provide objective agronomic research, a helping hand with soil and water stewardship, and timely industry news powered by the Soybean Checkoff. Learn more at iasoybeans.com.
Joined now for our closing markets here on Ag Matters PM by Kenan Layden of agmarket.net. Kenan, what did we see in the trade in the grains today?
Yeah, overall, a positive trade in the grain markets. Corn is looking to maybe test a monthly high at that 424 level. A close over that would be good to see. And then that bugaboo 430 number would be the next thing to watch there in that corn market. But a positive day for corn. Soybeans started the day off pretty hot. Kind of faded into the day. Spreads there kind of narrowed up to front months traded and held on to it a little better than some of the deferred months in that soybean contract. Still a lot of headline risk with that soybean contract with the whole China-US trade relations, and wheat off some of its lower prices, not necessarily a big move, but wheat not going down and having a few positive numbers here today on the board is always a good thing.
And of course, that story with the United States and China as it relates to soybeans is the big news story that it kind of has been moving the marketplace whenever there's a headline related to it. But are there any other news stories that you're watching right now this week, Kenan, when it relates to the grain side of the markets that we should be keeping an eye
on? In addition to the headline news risk, I think everyone does a good job of your listeners probably watching the fundamentals and technicals. Corn going to be watching to see if it can make some technical, levels, make a monthly high here, and then, maybe break that kind of wall it's had at that 430, excuse me, mark. Soybeans have traded up here, a good gain from their lows, and see if they can revisit some of their higher yearly ranges would be something I watch. Is there demand being stimulated that's not being reported here because we don't have flash sale reports coming through that is spurring some of this more near term kind of the market action we saw today with that November contract being oh, you know, higher in relation to the deferred months, or maybe that's just rolls from one month to another. So that'd be something I'm watching here. And wheat just seeing if it can find a floor and move off its lows in a meaningful way.
on the livestock side of the trade? How did cattle and hogs trade today?
Yeah, it was normally when I talk to you, the news is the other way. The grains have been the lagger, and the livestock market has been awesome. But a limit down day today in the feeder cattle. Right here at close, there was some a little bit before close, there was some comments from President Trump on cattle producers and lowering the price of beef, which the market opened up down to the day, but it reacted even more negatively to that. Um, cash is still fairly strong. The feeder index is off of its highs at 276, trading more towards that 272 level. But still historically high prices. One thing to think about with the cattle market is, when does the bullish stories not? When aren't they bullish anymore? Right? We have tight numbers. We have lack of heifer retention. But once the market prices all that in and overshoots it, we have no Brazil imports. We have the border not being open. Eventually, those things will shift, and how high is high enough, and the market usually overshoots, the cash prices and the cash falling down. So it'll be interesting to see that. Hopefully, that dynamic stays in place where cash keeps supporting the future markets, and it's weakened here over the past few days. So be watching that feeder cattle index moving here through the week. Hogs had a good reversal yesterday. They were down a lot of sessions in a row. And yesterday they kind of had traded lower, then traded higher, nice reversal. And they had an inside day today. So traded within yesterday's range. So be watching that. They were very oversold.
What's the best way for our viewers to get in touch for more marketing information?
Yeah, Mark, check us out at eggmarket.net and take a look at our intel and information that we provide to growers.
Kenan Layden, agmarket.net. Thanks so much for the time here today, Kenan. Appreciate it, and we'll speak again soon.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you to Kenan Layden of agmarket.net for our closing market discussion. Let's take a look at the closing numbers. You can find that information anytime under the Markets tab of our website at iowaagnet.com. December corn closes up 3 1/4 at $4.23 even. November soybeans up 4 cents at $10.34 3/4. December soybean meal up 3.10 at $2.90 even. December soybean oil down 58 cents at $50.07. Chicago wheat up 3 1/2 at $5.03 3/4. Minneapolis wheat up 3 cents at $5.48. Kansas City hard red wheat up 3 1/2 at $4.88 1/2. December oats up a 1/2 cent at $3.02 even. On the Merc, December live cattle down 5.60 at $239.83. November feeder cattle down 9.25 at $364.23. December lean hogs down 88 cents at $82.40. December pork cutout up $2 at $94 even. Class 3 milk up 9 cents at $17.07. That wraps up the closing markets for today and brings us to the end of today's show. You can find all of our content on our website at iowaagnet.com. You can follow us on social media at Facebook and X, and you can listen to our morning, midday, and closing market podcast, as well as our daily episodes of our Iowa Ag Matters podcast at Apple, Amazon, Spotify, YouTube, and Podbean. From the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network studios in Des Moines, I'm Mark Magnuson. For Riley Smith, Dustin Huffman, and Andy Peterson, you've been watching Ag Matters PM.